The gunshot exploded across the desert morning like a thunderclap, its echo rolling between the weathered buildings of Perdition Creek, before dying in the vast Arizona emptiness. Sheriff Marcus Doss lowered his smoking Colt .45 with deliberate slowness, his pale eyes scanning the 40-odd faces gathered around the auction platform, as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. Anyone else feel like testing my patience this morning? He drawled his voice, carrying the casual menace of a rattlesnake coiled in shade. The bullet had shattered a water barrel 20 feet away, sending precious liquid streaming into the thirsty earth, a waste that spoke louder than words about the sheriff's priorities. On the auction block, 10-year-old Eli Reeves stood with his spine straight as a rifle barrel, his thin arms wrapped protectively around baby Clara, while 5-year-old Anna pressed against his side. The boy's dark eyes never left Doss's face, even as silent tears carved clean tracks through the dust coating his hollow cheeks. His clothes were little more than rags, patched and repatched, until the original fabric was barely recognizable. But he wore them with the dignity of a king in exile. Jonas McKinnon watched from the crowd's ragged edge, his weathered hands clenched into fists that trembled with barely contained rage. At 43, the former cavalry sergeant bore the scars of 2 decades fighting Apaches, Mexicans, and the unforgiving frontier itself. His face was leather brown from desert sun, marked by lines that spoke of too much pain and too little laughter. The wedding ring on his finger caught the morning light, a golden reminder of the woman he'd buried 6 months ago along with their unborn child. Lot 17. Doss announced, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a livestock auctioneer. 3 prime specimens from the Copper Bell mine disaster. The boys strong enough for hard labor, the girls got potential for domestic service, and the baby. He shrugged with theatrical indifference. Well, someone might find her useful eventually. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Jonas felt his stomach turn to ice as the true horror of the situation crystallized. These weren't placement proceedings. This was a slave auction dressed up in the trappings of legal authority, but no less obscene for its veneer of legitimacy. Mrs. Cordelia Patterson, the sharp-tongued proprietor of the town's general store, made a small sound of disgust that was quickly stifled when Deputy Buck Morrison turned his cold stare her way. The woman who'd tongue-lashed grown men for tracking mud on her floors suddenly found herself studying her worn boots with intense fascination. Tom Bradley, the town blacksmith, stood with his massive frame coiled like a spring, his hands opening and closing in unconscious preparation for violence. At 38, Tom had the build of a man who'd spent his life wrestling red-hot iron into submission. But his gentle brown eyes revealed a soul that recoiled from cruelty in all its forms. Opening bid is $15. Doss continued, his smile sharp as a blade. That's a generous starting point considering the burden these orphans represent. The crowd shifted uneasily, boots scraping against the hard-packed earth. Jonas could see the war between compassion and fear playing out on weathered faces, good people who'd watched their town slowly poisoned by corruption, who'd learned to look away rather than face the consequences of resistance. $18, called a gravelly voice from the crowd's heart. Jonas turned to see Cyrus Walsh, whose silver mine had a reputation for swallowing workers whole. The man's face bore the scars of a cave-in that had killed 3 men, but his eyes held something far more dangerous than mere callousness. They held the calculating gleam of a predator who'd found fresh prey. 22, countered Pete Garvey, the lumber camp boss whose operation had seen more accidents than the territorial authorities cared to investigate. His smile revealed teeth stained brown by tobacco juice and neglect. Eli's arms tightened around his sisters as the bidding continued, each offer feeling like another nail in their collective coffin. Jonas watched the boy's face, seeing his own childhood reflected in those dark eyes, the helplessness, the terror of being at the mercy of adults who saw children as property rather than people. $30. Doss announced with satisfaction. Do I hear 35? The silence stretched like a hangman's rope, taut with unspoken horror. Jonas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried through 20 years of frontier warfare. It was the moment of decision, the point where a man either acted on his principles or learned to live with their absence. $50. The words erupted from his throat before conscious thought could stop them. Every head in the crowd turned toward him as he stepped forward, his cavalry boots ringing against the sun-baked earth with the measured cadence of a man marching to his own execution. $50 for all three. He repeated, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. And I'll take them right now. Doss's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or anticipation. With the sheriff, the distinction was often meaningless. Well. Jonas McKinnon decides to rejoin the land of the living. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That's a considerable sum for a man whose crops have been failing and whose grief has been consuming. The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to wound. Jonas felt the crowd's eyes upon him, measuring his reaction, waiting to see if he'd fold under pressure, as so many had before. It's my money, he said simply. Indeed, it is. Doss agreed, gesturing to his deputies with theatrical flourish. Bring the merchandise down. Looks like our grieving widower has found himself a new purpose in life. The word merchandise hung in the air like a curse, its implications clear to everyone present. As Eli helped his sisters down from the platform, his eyes met Jonas's across the small distance between them. In that gaze, Jonas saw a mirror of his own desperate hope. The fragile belief that perhaps, just perhaps, this adult might be different from all the others who'd failed them. Thank you, Eli whispered as they approached, the words barely audible above the desert wind. Jonas knelt to bring himself to the boy's eye level, his knees protesting the movement. Up close, he could see the evidence of recent hardship, the hollow cheeks, the two bright eyes, the careful way Eli moved to shield his sisters from potential threats. No thanks needed, son, Jonas said quietly. Let's go home. But even as they walked away from the auction block, Jonas caught the meaningful glances passing between Doss and his deputies. The sheriff's smile held promises of future reckoning, and Jonas knew with grim certainty that this transaction was far from over. The wagon ride to Jonas's ranch stretched across 5 miles of desert hardpan, a landscape so harsh it seemed to actively reject human habitation. The children huddled in the wagon bed among sacks of grain and supplies, their silence speaking volumes about the trauma they'd endured. Clara slept fitfully in Eli's arms, her tiny fist clutching at his torn shirt, while Anna pressed against her brother's side with the desperate intensity of someone clinging to her last source of security. Jonas's spread was modest, even by frontier standards, a collection of sun-bleached buildings carved from the desert through years of backbreaking labor. The main house was a 2-room structure of weathered timber and adobe, its flat roof designed to shed the occasional desert downpour. A small barn housed his livestock, while a corral contained the handful of horses that represented his primary source of income. But it was the details that revealed the man's character. The carefully maintained windmill that drew water from the underground spring, the vegetable garden that Sarah had tended with religious devotion, and the small cemetery plot where 2 wooden crosses marked the graves of his wife and unborn child. You can have the back room, Jonas said as he helped the children down from the wagon. I'll string up some canvas for privacy once we get organized. Eli nodded solemnly, his dark eyes cataloging every detail of their new surroundings. The boy had learned early that safety was always temporary, that adults' promises were as fragile as desert flowers in a sandstorm. He mentally mapped escape routes and hiding places, his survival instincts honed by months of uncertainty and loss. The first meal at Jonas's table was a quiet affair, beans and cornbread eaten by the light of a single oil lamp. The children ate with the controlled desperation of those who'd known real hunger, their eyes never leaving their plates except to check for signs of danger. Anna fell asleep at the table, exhaustion finally claiming her small body, while Clara fussed quietly in Eli's arms. "You can rest," Jonas told Eli gently. "You're safe here." The boy's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "That's what they said at the church before they put us on that block. That's what they said at the orphanage before they sold us like cattle." His voice carried the weight of betrayals too numerous to count. Adults say lots of things. The words cut deeper than Jonas had expected. He'd been fortunate his parents had died when he was already grown, sparing him the particular cruelty of broken promises from those meant to protect him. But looking at Eli's guarded expression, he recognized something achingly familiar. The look of a soldier who'd seen too many friends die to trust in anything but his own vigilance. "I know," Jonas said finally. "But I'm saying it anyway. You're safe here, and that's a promise I mean to keep." Eli studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. Finding none, he gave a small nod and trust not yet. But perhaps the beginning of possibility. That night, Jonas lay awake, listening to the sounds of the desert and the quiet breathing from the next room. For the first time in months, the empty house felt like something approaching a home. But even as he allowed himself a moment of cautious hope, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was yet to come. The next morning brought that test in the form of a note nailed to his front door, and the message brief but unmistakable. Some purchases come with unexpected costs. The fine print can be a killer. Jonas crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw clenching with familiar anger. He'd faced worse threats during his military service. But this felt different, more personal, more calculated. Doss wasn't just asserting his authority. He was declaring war. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Jonas grabbed his rifle and positioned himself at the window, watching as 3 riders approached at a leisurely pace, designed to project confidence rather than urgency. Deputy Buck Morrison led the group, his weak chin barely visible beneath the wide brim of his hat. Flanking him were 2 men Jonas didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional killers. Their eyes moved constantly, cataloging threats and opportunities with the cold efficiency of predators. "Morning, McKinnon," Morrison called out as they reined in their horses. "Sheriff sent us to check on the welfare of them children you took in. Make sure they're being properly cared for." Jonas stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "They're fine. Fed, clothed, and sleeping under a roof. More than they had yesterday." "That's good to hear," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Of course, there's been some talk in town about your fitness as a guardian. Folks wondering if a man drinking himself to death on a failing ranch is the best choice for raising children." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Jonas felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "I haven't touched a drop since I brought them home. As for the ranch, it's been supporting me just fine." One of the strangers, a lean man with dead eyes and a poorly healed scar across his left cheek, spat into the dust. "Funny thing about talk," he said, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone accustomed to violence. "Has a way of becoming truth if enough people hear it." The threat was clear, but Jonas had faced worse during his years in uniform. Also funny how quickly talk dies when folks learn the truth about who's spreading it. The exchange might have escalated, if not for the sound of children's laughter from inside the house. Anna's voice carried clearly through the open window, chattering to Clara in the animated tones of a 5-year-old, explaining the complexities of the world to someone even younger. Morrison's expression softened slightly at the sound, a reminder that even corrupted men might retain some trace of human decency. "Just remember, McKinnon," he said as they prepared to leave. "Children are fragile things. Accidents happen easy out here, especially to folks who don't know their place." After they'd ridden away, Jonas stood on his porch for a long time, his rifle across his arms and his mind racing through possibilities. The message had been delivered with crystal clarity: submit to Doss's authority or face the consequences. But Jonas had learned long ago that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The question was whether he was strong enough to protect 3 children from a corrupt sheriff and whatever forces stood behind him. The answer came sooner than expected. That afternoon, as Jonas worked to repair a section of fence damaged by the morning's visitors, Eli approached with the cautious manner of someone delivering bad news. "There's something you need to know," the boy said quietly, "about Sheriff Doss and what really happened at that auction." Jonas set down his tools and gave the boy his full attention. "What is it, son?" Eli glanced around nervously, then spoke in hushed tones. "At the orphanage before they brought us to town, I heard the men talking. They weren't just selling us to whoever bid the most. They had buyers already lined up, specific people who'd paid in advance." A chill ran down Jonas's spine as the implications became clear. "What kind of buyers?" "Bad ones," Eli replied simply. "Men who don't care about children, except as things to be used. The auction was just for show, to make it look legal. When nobody bid what they wanted, they were going to say, 'We'd been sent to territorial authorities.'" "But really," the boy's voice trailed off, but Jonas didn't need him to finish. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear: a trafficking operation using legal adoption procedures as cover, with corrupt officials providing legitimacy to what was essentially a slave market. "Who else knows about this?" Jonas asked. "Just me, I think. Anna was too scared to listen, and Clara's too young to understand. But I heard enough to know that we weren't the first, and we wouldn't have been the last." Jonas felt a cold fury building in his chest, not the hot anger of a moment's provocation, but the ice-cold rage of a man who discovered an evil that demanded response. If Eli was right, then Doss wasn't just a corrupt sheriff extorting money from desperate people. He was the local face of something far worse, a network that bought and sold children like livestock. "Thank you for telling me," Jonas said carefully. "But from now on, you don't mention this to anyone else. Not until we figure out how to use it." Eli nodded solemnly, but Jonas could see the weight of the secret in the boy's eyes. At 10 years old, he'd already learned more about the world's darkness than most adults ever would. That evening, as the desert heat faded into the cool of night, Jonas sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees. The children were asleep inside their quiet breathing, a reminder of what he was fighting to protect. But he knew that protection required more than just vigilance. It required action. The question was how to fight an enemy who controlled the legal system, who had connections reaching far beyond the boundaries of their small town. Jonas had faced long odds before, but never with so much to lose. Movement in the darkness caught his attention, a figure approaching on foot, careful to stay in the shadows. Jonas tensed his finger, finding the rifle's trigger, until a familiar voice called softly from the night. "Jonas, it's Ruth Carmichael. I need to talk to you." The schoolteacher emerged from the darkness, carrying a wicker basket, her normally composed face tight with worry. Ruth was one of the few educated women in the territory, a spinster who devoted her life to teaching children to read and write. She'd been Sarah's closest friend, and one of the few people in town with both the intelligence and the courage to see through Doss's facade. "I brought some things for the children," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Books, some clothes. Anna's grown out of medicine for Clara. But mostly I came to warn you." Inside the house, as Ruth distributed her gifts with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for children, she spoke in hushed tones about what she'd observed in town. "Doss has been asking questions about you," she reported. "Your mental state, your drinking, your fitness as a guardian. He's building a case to have the children removed from your care." "On what grounds?" Jonas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Does it matter?" Ruth's laugh was bitter. He's the sheriff, and you're a grieving widower who's been keeping to himself for months. All he needs is reasonable doubt about your stability, and he can do whatever he wants. Jonas felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in the tactical disadvantage of fighting an enemy who controlled the rules of engagement. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. There are others, Ruth continued as if reading his thoughts. People who've been watching what's happening, who know something's wrong, even if they can't prove it. Mrs. Patterson's been asking pointed questions around the store. Tom Bradley's been making noise about bringing in territorial authorities. Even some of the miners are starting to ask where all the orphans from the disaster really went. The mention of Tom Bradley gave Jonas a spark of hope. The blacksmith was built like a bull and had the temperament to match when roused to righteous anger. If Tom was taking an interest in Doss's activities, it meant Jonas had at least one ally who wouldn't be easily intimidated. "What do you think I should do?" Jonas asked. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving to the closed door behind which the children slept. "Fight," she said finally. "But fight smart. Doss has legal authority and connections we don't fully understand. But he doesn't have the entire community behind him. There are more good people in this town than bad ones. They just need someone to show them it's safe to stand up." After Ruth left, Jonas sat in the darkness, considering her words. The old soldier in him understood the tactical situation clearly enough. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting on terrain that favored his enemies. But he also understood something that Doss apparently didn't, that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and that men pushed far enough would find reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The question was whether he could find those reserves in others before Doss made his next move, because Jonas was increasingly certain that the sheriff wouldn't wait much longer to resolve what he saw as a temporary inconvenience. Over the following days, Jonas began to understand the true scope of the corruption that had infected Perdition Creek. It wasn't just Doss, it was a network of complicit officials, intimidated citizens, and outside interests that had turned their small town into a way station for human trafficking. The revelation came piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly revealing its horrifying picture. A conversation overheard at the general store. A nervous confession from a miner who'd seen too much. The careful questioning of children who'd witnessed things they didn't fully understand. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an unexpected ally, her sharp tongue and sharper mind cutting through the lies and evasions that had protected Doss's operation. "I've been keeping track," she told Jonas during a carefully casual conversation in her store. 12 children from the mine disaster. 8 from the typhoid outbreak last spring. 6 from various accidents over the past 2 years. 26 children total, all processed through Doss's office, all supposedly sent to territorial authorities for proper placement. But Jonas prompted. But territorial records show only 4 children received from Perdition Creek in the past 3 years. Either Doss is the most incompetent record keeper in the territory, or those children went somewhere else entirely. The mathematics of evil were stark and undeniable. 22 children had vanished into a system designed to obscure their fate, and Jonas's 3 had been destined to join them. The auction had been a sham from the beginning, a piece of theater designed to provide legal cover for what was essentially kidnapping and trafficking. Tom Bradley's investigation had revealed the other half of the equation. Strangers coming through town, he reported during a clandestine meeting at Jonas's ranch. Well-dressed men with expensive horses and no apparent business in mining or ranching. They meet with Doss, conduct their affairs in private, then leave with empty wagons that weren't empty when they arrived. "How often?" Jonas asked. "Monthly, sometimes more. Always around the time when new orphans are processed." Tom's massive hands clenched into fists. "Jesus, Jonas. What kind of monsters are we dealing with?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Eli, despite Jonas's warnings about secrecy, had been conducting his own investigation with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that his survival depended on knowing the truth. His youth and apparent innocence, had allowed him to observe conversations and activities that adults would have missed. "They call him Garrett," the boy reported one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "The man who comes to buy children. He has a big operation down in Mexico across the border where the law can't reach him. Sheriff Doss gets paid for each child he delivers, but he also gets to keep a percentage of what Garrett sells them for." The casual way Eli delivered this information and the matter-of-fact tone of a child who'd learned to speak of horrors as everyday realities broke something in Jonas's heart. No 10-year-old should have such knowledge. But Eli's survival had depended on understanding the world's darkest corners. "How do you know all this?" Jonas asked gently. "Because I listen," Eli replied simply. "Because when you're small and scared, adults forget you're there. Because they talk about children like we're not people, like we can't understand what they're planning." Anna looked up from her cornbread, her 5-year-old face troubled. "Is the bad man coming for us?" Jonas reached across the table to squeeze her small hand. "No, sweetheart. Not while I'm here." But even as he spoke, the words Jonas knew they were a promise he might not be able to keep. The forces arrayed against them were larger and more organized than he'd initially realized. Doss wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was a key player in a network that stretched across multiple territories with connections to federal officials and international criminals. The full scope of the danger became clear 3 days later, when Jonas rode into town for supplies and found the main street buzzing with activity. A group of well-dressed strangers had arrived on the morning stage, their expensive clothes and authoritative manner immediately identifying them as territorial officials. "Our child welfare inspectors," Mrs. Patterson whispered as Jonas loaded supplies into his wagon. "Sent by the territorial governor to investigate reports of irregularities in local adoption procedures." Jonas felt his heart sink. If Doss had connections high enough to summon territorial officials, then the corruption reached far beyond their small town. These weren't legitimate investigators. They were part of the network sent to provide official cover for whatever Doss was planning. When Jonas asked, "Tomorrow morning, they'll be visiting your ranch to assess the children's welfare and your fitness as a guardian." Mrs. Patterson's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Doss has been feeding them stories about your drinking, your mental state, your inability to provide proper care." The trap was closing with the methodical precision of a military operation. Jonas had perhaps 18 hours to decide whether to fight or flee, and neither option offered much hope of success. That night, as he sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, Jonas made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. He was going to trust his neighbors, not just Ruth and Tom, but the entire community that had watched silently as corruption poisoned their town. It was time to find out what Perdition Creek was really made of. The confrontation began at dawn with the arrival of the territorial officials at Jonas's ranch. There were 5 of them, 2 men who claimed to be child welfare inspectors, 2 federal marshals, and a territorial judge, who'd presumably come to provide legal authority for whatever was about to happen. Jonas met them at his front door, his rifle held casually but ready. Behind him, the children huddled in the kitchen, their faces pale with fear. "Mr. McKinnon." The lead inspector said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "I'm Inspector Hartwell from the Territorial Child Welfare Office. We're here to assess the conditions under which these children are being kept." "They're being kept fed, clothed, and safe," Jonas replied evenly. "More than they had before I took them in. That's commendable," Hartwell replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "However, we've received reports of irregularities in your guardianship. Concerns about your fitness, your mental state, your ability to provide proper care." The accusations hung in the morning air like smoke from a grass fire. Jonas felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "What kind of concerns?" "You're drinking for one thing," one of the marshals interjected. Reports suggest you've been consuming alcohol to excess, creating an unsafe environment for the children. I haven't touched a drop since I brought them home, Jonas replied. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. Your mental state is also in question, Hartwell continued. The recent loss of your wife and child, your isolation, your erratic behavior. Several witnesses have expressed concern about your stability. Jonas felt the familiar sensation of being outmaneuvered by an enemy who controlled the rules of engagement. These weren't legitimate concerns. They were carefully constructed lies designed to provide legal justification for removing the children from his care. I want to see your credentials, Jonas said firmly. And I want to know who made these reports. The officials exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly in the face of unexpected resistance. Mr. McKinnon, Hartwell said carefully, we're here on the authority of the territorial government. Your cooperation is required by law. Then you won't mind providing documentation of that authority, Jonas replied, along with specific evidence of these alleged concerns. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Jonas could see the calculation in the officials' eyes. They'd expected to find a broken man, easily intimidated and quickly disposed of. Instead, they'd found someone willing to fight back. The tension was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not just one or two riders, but a dozen or more. Jonas turned to see a sight that filled his heart with hope. Tom Bradley leading a group of townspeople, their faces grim with determination. Morning, Jonas, Tom called out as the group dismounted. Heard you were having visitors. Thought we'd come pay our respects. Ruth Carmichael stepped forward, her schoolteacher's voice, carrying the authority of education and moral certitude. Gentlemen, I'm Ruth Carmichael, and I represent the Perdition Creek Women's Association. We're here to observe these proceedings and ensure that the children's best interests are being served. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the group, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Funny thing about those reports you mentioned, she said to Hartwell. I know everyone in this town, and I can't think of a single person who'd have legitimate concerns about Jonas's care of those children. The officials found themselves surrounded by hostile faces, their authority suddenly in question. These weren't the cowed citizens they'd expected. These were people who decided to stand up and fight. This is highly irregular, Hartwell blustered. We're conducting official territorial business. Then you won't mind if we observe. Ruth interrupted smoothly. After all, this is a matter of public interest. The welfare of orphaned children concerns the entire community. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted most of the morning. The officials attempted to assert their authority, while the townspeople politely but firmly insisted on their right to observe and question. Jonas found himself in the surreal position of watching his neighbor's people he'd barely spoken to in months risk their own safety to protect him and the children. The breakthrough came when Tom Bradley produced a telegraph message he'd received from the territorial capital. Funny thing, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man holding a winning hand. I took the liberty of contacting the real Territorial Child Welfare Office. They have no record of any Inspector Hartwell, and they certainly didn't authorize any investigation of Jonas McKinnon's guardianship. The color drained from Hartwell's face as the implications sank in. Around him, his associates began to shift nervously, their hands moving closer to their weapons. You're making a serious mistake. One of the marshals warned, his voice tight with barely controlled violence. You have no idea what you're interfering with. I know exactly what we're interfering with. Ruth replied, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. We're interfering with the illegal trafficking of children conducted under the cover of territorial authority. The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Jonas saw the moment when the officials realized their cover was blown, when the pretense of legality gave way to naked desperation. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. One of the marshals went for his gun, only to find himself facing a dozen armed townspeople who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The other officials scattered their expensive clothes, an authoritative manner forgotten in the face of imminent death. When the dust settled, two of the fake officials lay dead in Jonas's yard, while the others had fled into the desert on foot. The townspeople stood in a rough circle, their faces pale but determined, their weapons still smoking in the morning heat. "Jesus," Tom Bradley muttered, staring at the bodies. "What have we done? What we had to do?" Ruth replied firmly. "What we should have done years ago." But Jonas knew this was just the beginning. The fake officials had been pawns in a larger game, and their elimination would only bring more dangerous players into the field. Somewhere out there, men like Garrett were learning that their operation had been compromised, and they wouldn't hesitate to use whatever force was necessary to protect their investment. The real war was just beginning. The aftermath of the morning's violence brought a grim understanding of what they were truly facing. As the townspeople buried the dead and cleaned up the evidence, Jonas found himself thrust into the role of military commander, a position he'd never wanted but couldn't refuse. "They'll be back," he told the assembled group as they gathered in his kitchen. "Probably in greater numbers, definitely with more firepower. We've crossed a line here and there's no going back." Ruth nodded grimly. "The question is whether we can hold out long enough for real territorial authorities to arrive. Assuming they're not part of the corruption, too," Tom added darkly. "This thing goes deeper than we thought." The group spent the afternoon planning their defense, using Jonas's military experience to transform the small ranch into a fortress. They established fields of fire, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared defensive positions that would make any assault as costly as possible. But as evening approached, Jonas realized they were missing a crucial element: intelligence about their enemy's capabilities and intentions. They were preparing to fight an enemy they didn't fully understand, with resources they couldn't accurately assess. The answer came from an unexpected source. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a lone rider approached the ranch. Jonas tensed his rifle ready until he recognized the figure as Deputy Morrison. But this wasn't the weak-chinned lackey who delivered Doss's threats. This was a man who'd apparently found his backbone, his face set, with the determination of someone who'd finally chosen a side. "Don't shoot," Morrison called out as he dismounted. "I'm here to help." The revelation that followed reshaped everything they thought they knew about their situation. Morrison, it turned out, had been documenting Doss's activities for months. Building a case that he'd been afraid to present to territorial authorities he wasn't sure he could trust. "Garrett's coming," Morrison reported without preamble. "Got word an hour ago. He's bringing 20 men, maybe more. They'll be here tomorrow night, and they're not planning to take prisoners." Jonas felt his blood turn to ice. 20 professional gunmen against a handful of townspeople with limited combat experience. The odds were impossibly long. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Doss has been in contact with corrupt officials in the territorial capital. They're planning to blame everything on you, Jonas. The dead officials, the missing children, the whole operation. You'll be painted as a madman who kidnapped children and killed anyone who tried to stop him." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Jonas had stumbled into a network that reached from the Mexican border to the territorial capital, with tentacles extending into federal law enforcement and international criminal organizations. "Why are you telling us this?" Ruth asked suspiciously. "Why now?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Because I've got a daughter, and I finally realized that if I don't stop this now, she might end up on that auction block someday. Because I'm tired of being part of something that makes me sick to my stomach every time I think about it." The deputy's information allowed them to prepare for the coming assault, but it also revealed the hopelessness of their position. Even if they somehow survived Garrett's attack, they'd still face the full weight of territorial authority turned against them, unless they could find a way to expose the truth to people who mattered, people with the power and integrity to act on it. The solution came from Mrs. Patterson, whose sharp mind had been working through the problem with characteristic thoroughness. "The territorial governor," she said suddenly. "He's not part of this. I know his wife went to school with her back east. If we could get word to him." "How?" Tom asked. "Every telegraph line in the territory runs through operators who might be compromised." "The railroad," Ruth said quietly. "The morning train stops in Tucson. If someone could get word to the governor through channels Doss doesn't control." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only chance they had. As the townspeople prepared for the siege, Ruth volunteered to make the dangerous ride to Tucson, carrying Morrison's evidence and Mrs. Patterson's personal letter to the governor's wife. "I can travel fast and light," she insisted when Jonas protested. "And I know the back trails better than most men in this territory." The decision to let her go was one of the hardest Jonas had ever made. But he knew she was right. If they were all going to die defending the ranch, at least someone needed to survive to tell the truth. Ruth left at midnight, her horse's hooves muffled with cloth as she slipped away into the desert darkness. Jonas watched her go with a heavy heart, knowing he might never see her again. The next day passed with agonizing slowness as they completed their preparations. The children were moved to the root cellar, the safest place on the property, with strict instructions to stay hidden no matter what they heard above. Anna cried when Jonas explained they might have to fight bad men, but Eli's face was set with grim understanding. "Will you come back?" the boy asked quietly. Jonas knelt to meet his eyes. "I'm going to try my damnedest, son. But if something happens to me, you take care of your sisters. You get them to Ruth in Tucson, and you tell everyone who'll listen what really happened here." Eli nodded solemnly, accepting a responsibility no child should have to bear. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jonas took his position behind the reinforced walls of his barn, surrounded by the townspeople who'd chosen to stand with him. Tom Bradley manned the house's upper window, his massive frame barely fitting through the opening. Mrs. Patterson, proving that her sharp tongue was matched by steady nerves, had claimed a position in the kitchen with a clear view of the back approach. They didn't have long to wait. Garrett's men came with the sunset, their approach marked by a dust cloud that rose like smoke against the crimson sky. Jonas counted at least 20 riders, just as Morrison had warned their silhouettes dark against the dying light. They moved with the casual confidence of professionals who'd done this kind of work before. The man leading them was unmistakably Garrett himself, a tall figure in expensive clothes, who sat his horse like a cavalry officer. Even at a distance, Jonas could see the pale eyes that had probably been the last thing dozens of children had seen before disappearing forever. "McKinnon." Garrett's voice carried clearly across the desert air. "I understand you have something that belongs to me." Jonas's response was a rifle shot that kicked up dust near Garrett's horse. The message was clear enough. What followed was a siege that tested every skill Jonas had learned in 20 years of frontier warfare. Garrett's men were professionals, but they were fighting people defending their homes and children. The townspeople, despite their lack of military experience, fought with the desperate courage of those who knew defeat meant death. The battle raged through the night, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. The barn's walls, reinforced with adobe and sandbags, turned aside most bullets, but the constant barrage wore away at both the defenses and the defenders' nerves. Tom Bradley proved to be a deadly shot, his hunting skills translating perfectly to combat. Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by demonstrating an uncanny ability to place shots exactly where they would do the most damage to enemy morale. Even Morrison, fighting to redeem years of complicity, showed a courage that Jonas hadn't expected. But as dawn approached, their situation grew increasingly desperate. They were running low on ammunition, several defenders were wounded, and Garrett's men showed no signs of giving up. The turning point came just as Jonas was beginning to think they couldn't hold out much longer. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the east sent his heart racing, reinforcements for Garrett or salvation from an unexpected source. The answer came in the form of Ruth Carmichael riding at the head of a column of federal marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Behind them rode territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and even a photographer from the territorial capital. Caught between two forces and faced with legitimate federal authority, Garrett's men began to surrender. The criminal leader himself tried to escape into the desert, but Tom Bradley's rifle ended that attempt with a shot that dropped the man from his saddle. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Morrison's evidence, combined with Ruth's first-hand testimony and the physical evidence at the ranch, exposed the full scope of the trafficking network. Arrests were made across multiple territories. Children were rescued from horrible fates, and corrupt officials at every level found themselves facing federal charges. Sheriff Doss, when finally cornered in his office, chose to go down fighting rather than face justice. His death ended the immediate threat, but it also ensured that some secrets would die with him. In the weeks that followed, Jonas found himself at the center of a media storm that painted him as a hero who'd risked everything to save 3 orphaned children. The attention made him uncomfortable, but it served a purpose. It brought scrutiny to child welfare practices throughout the territory and resulted in reforms that would protect future generations. More importantly to Jonas, it brought legal recognition of his adoption of Eliana and Clara. The papers were signed in the territorial capital, with the governor himself serving as witness. For the first time in their young lives, the children had a legally recognized family. The ranch was rebuilt with help from the entire community, stronger and better than before. The vegetable garden that Sarah had tended was expanded and improved, tended now by Anna, with the same devotion her adoptive mother had shown. The root cellar that had sheltered the children during the siege was converted into a proper storm shelter, though Jonas hoped it would never be needed for its original purpose again. Eli grew into his role as big brother and heir to the ranch, his early maturity tempered by the security of knowing he was truly wanted. He showed a natural talent for working with horses and an intellectual curiosity that Ruth carefully nurtured through expanded lessons. Anna bloomed into a confident, cheerful child whose laughter filled the house with joy. She appointed herself the family's official storyteller, regaling anyone who'd listen with elaborate tales of adventure and heroism that usually featured brave children rescuing adults from various predicaments. Clara, too young to remember the auction or the siege, grew up knowing only love and security. Her first word was, "Papa," directed at Jonas with a smile that could melt the hardest heart. The town itself was transformed by the events. The corruption that had poisoned it for years was finally exposed and rooted out. Tom Bradley was elected sheriff, a position he accepted reluctantly, but fulfilled with quiet competence. Mrs. Patterson became the unofficial mayor, organizing the community's growth with the same efficiency she'd once applied to running her store. Ruth established a proper school funded by donations from across the territory and staffed by teachers who understood that education was the best defense against future predators. The curriculum included not just reading and arithmetic, but lessons about children's rights and how to recognize and report abuse. The auction block still stood in the main street, but now it served as a monument rather than a threat. A bronze plaque had been mounted on its side, reading, "In memory of all children who suffered here, and in hope that such suffering will never be tolerated again." On the 3rd anniversary of that terrible auction, Jonas stood in his rebuilt barn, watching his children play in the yard. Clara chased butterflies with the determined intensity of a 4-year-old on a mission, while Anna organized a group of visiting children into some elaborate game that seemed to involve equal parts theater and athletics. Eli, now 13 and showing signs of the man he would become, helped Jonas repair tack with the patient competence that had become his trademark. The suspicious guarded boy who'd once calculated escape routes was gone, replaced by a confident young man who saw the world as a place of possibility rather than threat. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Tom commented, joining Jonas in the barn's doorway. The big blacksmith had aged well in his role as sheriff, his natural authority enhanced by the respect he'd earned during the siege. "Same place, different people. Jonas replied, watching his children with quiet satisfaction. Or maybe the same people finally free to be who they really were. Ruth approached from the house carrying a letter that had arrived on the morning stay. "News from the territorial capital," she announced. "The last of Garrett's network has been broken up. 43 children rescued in Mexico, all being returned to families or placed in legitimate homes. The number was staggering, 43 young lives saved, because Jonas had been unwilling to let 3 orphans face a terrible fate alone. But Jonas barely heard the praise that followed. His attention was fixed on something more important, at the sound of his children's laughter carrying across the desert air. As evening approached, the family gathered around the dinner table, as they did every night. It was a simple meal: beef from their own cattle, vegetables from Anna's garden, bread baked in Sarah's old oven. But it was seasoned with something that no amount of money could buy: the knowledge that they were truly a family, bound together by choice, rather than blood, by love, rather than obligation. After dinner, as had become their tradition, Jonas told the children a story. Sometimes it was an adventure tale from one of Ruth's books, sometimes a story from his own past, carefully edited for young ears. But tonight, Anna made a special request. "Tell us the story about the day you saved us, Papa," she said, settling against his side with comfortable familiarity. So Jonas told the story again, as he had countless times before. But this time, as he spoke of fear and courage, of communities divided and united, of the price of doing what was right, he found himself adding details he'd never shared before. He told them about Sarah, about the loneliness that had nearly consumed him, about how their arrival had brought purpose back to a life that had seemed finished. He spoke of the moment when he'd realized that saving them was really about saving himself, that love given freely always returned, multiplied. He talked about the friends who'd stood with him, Ruth and Tom and Mrs. Patterson, and all the others who'd risked everything to protect 3 children they barely knew. He explained how courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear. As he finished the story, Clara fell asleep in his arms, while Anna and Eli leaned against him, with the absolute trust that only comes from perfect security. Around them, the desert night was alive, with the sounds of a harsh but beautiful land coyotes calling to their packs, winds singing through the sage, the distant sound of the night train, carrying travelers to new lives and fresh starts. "I love you, Papa," Anna whispered sleepily. "I love you too, sweetheart." Jonas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you. More than all the stars in the sky." In the distance, those stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, each point of light a promise that even in the harshest places, love could take root and grow. The auction block still stood in the center of town, but its shadow no longer fell across their lives. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, scarred but whole, tested but unbroken. Jonas McKinnon, former cavalry sergeant turned protective father, sat with his family in a house that no longer echoed with loneliness. The children who'd once stood terrified on an auction block now slept safely in beds they knew were theirs, dreaming dreams that were no longer haunted by fear. The promise had been kept, the circle closed, and the story complete. In a land where justice was often as scarce as water in the desert, 3 orphaned children had found not just a home, but a father who would move heaven and earth to keep them safe. And in protecting them, Jonas had discovered his own salvation. The understanding that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply refusing to walk away when someone needs you to stay. The desert wind carried away the last echoes of old fears, leaving only peace, only family, only home. The auction block's shadow had been lifted forever, replaced by the enduring light of love, freely given and joyfully received. And in that light, they had found their way home.